and introduce our panelists. So it's my deep pleasure and honor to introduce Kurt Orderson. Kurt is an award-winning filmmaker from Cape Town, South Africa. His career started after completing his film and television studies at Monash University, South Africa in 2004. His films infuse music, history, politics, and art with current geopolitical affairs, examining issues and unknown stories to create narratives in impermanent settings. He has directed 8 feature documentary films shot between 5 continents as well. More than 20 current affairs insert. In 2009, he founded Anzania Rising Productions, an award-winning company consisting of a collective of filmmakers and activists who collaborate and create film and media content that facilitates unity and solidarity, forms new alliances, and creates compelling content to stimulate public discourse. The company aspires to tell stories about Africa, African diaspora, and Africa's legacy and world heritage to revive political consciousness and honor the struggle of our foremothers and fathers. Before this, he worked for 6 years at South African Broadcasting Corporation and several other production companies. He has produced, shot, directed high-end educational documentaries, news, and current affairs shows. His work has featured on broad spectrum of outlets, including Al Jazeera, ESPN, ZDF Germany, ETV, TRT Turkey, and Hulu. He has guest lectured at various universities, including the University of Cape Town, University of Pennsylvania, the University of São Paulo, Johns Hopkins University, Brown University, University of West Indies, and the University of Toronto. Not in My Neighborhood, his most recent feature documentary won the Audience Award at Encounters International Film Festival, Best Documentary, at the HBO American Black Film Festival, and Jury Award Outstanding Film at the African International Film Festival. Our next panelist is Dr. Kisha Khan-Perry. And Dr. Kisha Khan-Perry is an associate professor of Africana Studies at Brown University, where she specializes in race, gender, and politics in the Americas, urban geography, and questions of citizenship, intellectual history, and disciplinary formation, and the interrelationship between scholarship, pedagogy, and political engagement. Her first book, Black Women Against the Land Grab, The Fight for Racial Justice in Brazil, is an ethnographic study of Black women's activism in Brazilian cities. She currently has 3 book projects underway: Evictions and Convictions, The Gendered Racial Logic of Black Dispossession in New York City, The Historical Paradox of Citizenship, Black Land Ownership and Loss in the Americas, and Anthropology for Liberation, Research, Writing, and Teaching for Social Justice. Our final panelist is Muiza Muntali. Muiza Muntali is a Malawian-born activist and specialist in Africa and African diaspora affairs. He is the host and producer of Washington, D.C.'s Pacifica station, WPFW 89.3 FM radio show Africa Now. Africa Now is a radio show that discusses topical issues pertinent to the Africans and the African diaspora in Africa, the Caribbean, and the Americas. He is the co-founder and co-director of Africa World Now Project, an educational multimedia platform that seeks to merge theory with practice through an active agenda where we engage in efforts that map the continuities in history, politics, culture of the African world. Africa World Now Project seeks to reconnect Africa with known and forgotten parts. And just a plug, we know Africa World Now Project airs every Wednesday at 7 p.m. on WSNC, WSSU's radio station, 90.5. Muiza Muntali is co-host and co-producer of Africa World Now Project Radio. And for 10 years, Muiza Muntali has been a lead coordinator of the following film series presentations: African Diaspora Film, International Film Festival in Washington, D.C. from 2006 to the present, DC Caribbean Film Festival from 2001 to present, and the New African Film Festival from 2004 to present. Monthly film series at Bloom Bars from 2011 to 2019. And previously, Mr. Muntali served in various capacities at the foreign policy advocacy organization, Trans-Africa Forum for over 20 years, including using film as an educational tool through various film presentations. So please join me with welcoming just and appreciating the time and energy, spiritual and intellectual labor and creativity of our panelists. And for our conversation tonight, this is the first film in our Towards a Black Geographies film series, A Pedagogy and Practice. And I wanted to just really kind of contextualize and frame the conversation that we're having and thinking about Kurt Orderson's film, Not in Our Neighborhood, as a Black geographic text. And when we think about what a Black geographies is, I would be remiss if I did not tell you this story. Black geographies as a field, and it really is the spatial expression of Africana studies and Black studies. This insurrectionary knowledge tradition and formation that really draws so much of its analysis from the masses of struggle of Africana people in the world, our cultures, our histories, our particular experience in the continent, and the ways in which we've migrated out, the types of histories and societies and knowledge systems, spiritual systems, scientific modalities that we have created. So when we think about Black geographies, it was recently conceptualized and theorized about more than a decade ago by Catherine McKittrick and Clyde Woods. And I think about just in this moment, Clyde Woods a lot, and it's almost, and this was not intentional, but I think it was the ancestors and it was Clyde really working. 10 years ago, almost to the date, it was March 10th, 2011, I organized one of the last panels that Clyde Woods was on and before he transitioned as an ancestor. And it was called Towards Black Geographies. It was for the Critical Ethnic Studies Conference that was thinking about the future of genocide, settler colonialism, heteropatriarchy, and white supremacy. And Clyde Woods, who was a student of the South and many Souths, he reminded us that the South was key to understanding the experience of Africana Black working people. He reminded me and many of his other students that our intellectual work and our organizing work as people of African descent needed to map our connections, not only in the US South, but through the African world. To think about and study and organize and agitate about the ways in which our lives, our creative expressive cultures, our histories, our struggles are connected, and that the South and the many Souths were pivotal regions that in many ways not only drove the United States and its practices and policies throughout the world, but also the ways in which, specifically for Clyde and for all of us, the ways that plantation capitalism, colonialism, imperialism, and its modalities of political governance, the ways in which it organized society, the designs of society, and the knowledge production that underwrites the modern world permeates in varied ways and variegated manifestation, and that the nature of capitalism, racial capitalism, plantation capitalism, produces all sorts of crisis. And then thinking through and thinking with, and hopefully beyond people like Clyde Woods, Cedric, I'm thinking about our other ancestors, Cedric Robinson. And I wanted to, because I have so many students that are here with us, I also wanted to map our intellectual genealogies. As well as we map our ancestral genealogies, we're building off of the work of our elders, off of the work of our ancestors. And so I think of Stephen Biko, I think of Robert Sobukwe, I think of Ella Baker, I think of Claudia Jones. And that when we we're thinking about a Black geographies, or we're thinking about an Africana indigenous geographies, or we're thinking through the spaces and places where traditional geography doesn't, and I would say, and I would argue, our traditional knowledge systems don't see these spaces and places and people as being political theorists, as being producers of knowledge. So when we think about and engage a Black geographies, and we're thinking about indigenous geographies or an Africana geographies, these spaces and places where knowledge is being produced and circulated, transmitted and disseminated, we're also thinking about the ways in which it provides us new theoretical, methodological, and pedagogical approaches for analyzing our collective pasts, historicizing the present, and articulating our different futures. It's the relationship for the struggle for global justice that we amplify our struggles on the ground and those theories and philosophies of liberation that animate them. That our creative cultural expressions provide direct and measured guidance for our futurity, where radically new worlds live. So Black geographies, in essence, in so many different ways, is our intelligence, our creativity in action, a collective self-awareness of the limits of the present and past order of the world, an active transformation of that world. And I'm thinking about Ronald Judy, his work Sentient Flesh that just came out. And he says, when we're thinking about this active transformation of the world, we're thinking about it even if, especially if, that means vandalizing the sacred something that keeps this little world going. So this is what our film today in this Torch Black Geography film screening and discussion allows us to do. It allows us to strategize, to learn from one another, to be in community with each other, with the earth, with our ecosystems. It allows us to gather together. It allows us to create futures that allow for fuller expressions of humanity. So with that, I really wanted to invite our panelists, Muzamatal and Kisha Khan-Perry, to offer us some opening remarks and some reflections on the film, and we can really jump into a conversation.
I think I'll defer to Kisha this time. Yeah, Kisha, you can say it.
Hi, good evening. First, I want to thank Dr. Siddiqui for inviting me to participate, as well as want to continue to congratulate as well Kurt Orderson for his film, one of the best documentary films I've seen in recent times. And of course, as well, it's great to be on the panel with Muiza Muntali, who I hadn't had a chance to meet in person, but certainly I've heard your voice many a time. So thank you for the invitation to participate in this conversation, which I hope will be a conversation and dialogue about why this film is so important and continues to be important. Also, I just was just remembering that when we showed the film at Brown, it was actually one of the first times we showed it in the United States. It's good to watch it again. I've taught it in my classes. And it's just good to be part of a much more global conversation about what this means. I want to begin my brief comments, with just the opening that appears in the beginning of the film. And one of the activists say, all of our struggles, all of our movements are one and the same. And that's something that I've said over and over, and even my own work around the fact that all of these struggles are connected in some ways. I think it is so important that the film features Cape Town, New York, and São Paulo, three of the largest cities in the African diaspora, but also it begs us to ask the question then of what does it mean when we start to really hone in on some of the major global cities with strong or historically strong African descendant populations, and what does it mean for our understanding of racism, anti-Black racism, as well as the anti-Black racism struggle when we focus on those cities where Black people are being pushed out, even though they are central to the construction and of those metropolitan areas. So I want to say that there are a couple of key points that emerge out of these films. One is that cities are always contested terrains. They're one of the most important terrains of struggle, especially for Black people in the diaspora. Also, that this film features that contestations over urban space, especially a sense of belonging, is one of the most important, I think, anti-Black racism, one important dimension of the anti-Black racism struggles today. And that also these struggles are interconnected globally. Also, I want to make the point that this film features that it's not just about the demolition of homes or the displacement of buildings or renovation of buildings and gentrification in terms of the abstract sense, but certainly what does it mean when it impacts human beings and human lives? How are people impacted by these infrastructural changes? So what does it mean to actually not just demolish buildings, but also destroy lives and communities in the process? And this also takes us far back. And I think one of the best features in terms of looking at the historical work for this film is certainly it features displacement as part of a core of how we understand the violences that we're experiencing today, from the capture in terms of the African continent, to displacement in the barracoons and plantation slavery, et cetera, to the present day construction of modern cities and the redevelopment of modern cities. So again, when we think about questions of housing, especially in terms of access to decent, basic, decent housing, quality housing, basic infrastructure, that is housing that's free of violence. We have to think about the historical processes that have brought us to this present moment. So when people talk about also housing as a basic human right, it's also an extension of the longue durée of struggle for belonging, citizenship, a collective understanding of our humanity, or what does it mean to belong in these spaces. So other points that come up in the film that I want to emphasize is why the emphasis on policing is so important. Policing exists primarily because one is to control, and as obviously a source of control, but certainly because always where there's domination, there's always resistance. And the fact that people have always been resisting their displacement is one of the reasons why policing is so prevalent in these spaces, right? So one of the things people say is that wherever there's gentrification taking place or mass displacement, that's where you also see a ramping up of policing, militarized policing, and increased violence to further push people out. So I think it's a struggle over space, but it's also a struggle over kind of how we understand ourselves as humans in these spaces, a struggle over our own humanity in these spaces, as well as redefining how we think about things like kinship, community, family that are tied to space. And I would say that these understandings of community and kinship and neighborhood and neighbors really challenge our understandings of things like ownership and property, right? Ownership is not about capitalist investment in the space per se for profit. It's really ownership in terms of a collective sense of belonging. I think it's Dion Brand that talks about a landing. What does it mean for African diasporic people to be planted, to be grounded in a space after being forcibly displaced over and over centuries, right? So it's not about owning the space per se in that settler colonialist logic. It's really about what does it mean to be planted and rooted and belonging and building community over time, so claiming space. And I think the example of the Occupy movement in São Paulo, for example, is really important because one, Black people oftentimes left out of the history of knowledge on occupation or even Occupy movements throughout the diaspora, and also how these communities are, and activists, housing rights activists are given new life to oftentimes vertical wastelands, as they've been described, but also spaces that were built only for profit are now being used to socialize access to basic resources such as water, housing, closer to spaces where people work, and so forth. So given new life and redefining this, or basically inverting this capitalist logic of how we use urban space only for profit. It also highlights the kinds of ways that really complicated ways that people experience infrastructural violence, such as not just poor quality housing, but certainly poor quality transportation and how they interact. I mean, even the recent episodes in Texas, for example, with blackouts and water shortages in Native American communities, et cetera, are also intertwined. That poor quality housing, poor transportation, policing, pushing people out, the nuisance calls are all part of what the activists called spatial violence. So struggles over sidewalks, barbecuing, loitering, the pushing out and criminalization of homeless people are all one and the same, tied to mass evictions, tied to increased policing that is tied to mass incarceration, et cetera. So what I'm encouraging, and I should just try to wrap up, and I can keep talking in the conversation, is that what I want to overemphasize, and I think the film does such a brilliant job, is one, we need to rethink how all of these processes are interrelated in terms of housing justice, police and prison abolition, fair wages, education, public education, public health, access to food without chemicals, clean air. And we see how that's also playing out in the current moment in terms of our experiences with the COVID virus. So partly, I want to end by one, citing Noliwe Rooks. I saw a lecture by her earlier today where she said we should be aware of discourses of even development and redevelopment that talk about things like food deserts, or that start to promote a discourse around what is lacking in these urban areas, that then promote things like urban gardening, but are also tied to gentrification. So oftentimes what you see in the construction of certain kind of new access to in an attempt to remedy things like food deserts, what you see is an encouragement of new populations coming in to further gentrify and push out traditional residents. So I want to also end by saying, I stand in solidarity with the ongoing struggles, fighting the ongoing struggles over an end to evictions, especially during the pandemic, but also the struggles such as even the work that the Cost of War Project is doing, that have claimed that $6.4 trillion have been spent since in the post 9/11 wars. And what if we think about the amount of money that's invested in building up these cities, and in the amount of money spent in destroying, I should say, these cities around the world, what would that kind of investment look like in terms of housing, public education, et cetera, if we were to divest from the military industrial complex and invest in communities in terms of entrepreneurship, affordable housing, community spaces of leisure, free public transportation that promote free movements across between neighborhoods, increased wages so people can also have a sense of economic independence. So what would a real social justice movement look like if we start to invest in a broader sense of what it means to be Black in the diaspora, right? So it's not only, I think oftentimes the police abolition movement, or even the prison industrial complex, or even the general struggle against police brutality, et cetera, are oftentimes distant from the housing struggle. And I would say that the housing struggle is really at the core. Where we live matters. The kinds of resources we access in the spaces where we live matters. How we experience these violences are deeply connected to the other violences we experience. So what does it mean to read these violences together in terms of a much broader understanding of how Black lives matter and where they matter in the places where we live? So I'll just end there.
Thank you so much, Kisha Khan. And before I have Muiza kind of share his remarks, I want to open a question for Kurt, and something that you can think about as Muiza is sharing his remarks. But I'm really interested to find out what your material and non-material influences are, your own political and intellectual trajectory, and really where you see the trajectory of your work coming from Not in Our Neighborhood. And then also next month, we're going to be viewing your film, We Rise for Our Land. So this is something that, I want us to really kind of like map out your own intellectual genealogies, your own sort of like trajectories in terms of where you see your work going, what you're working on right now, and what were some of those, ancestral or personal or intellectual influences that really moved the work that you're doing. And so in doing so, I'm going to give you some time to think about that. But sorry, I muted myself. I would love to hear some of your remarks and your comments on the film, and then open it up for Kurt, and hopefully we can have somewhat of a cipher in terms of our conversation.
It's my turn, or? Yeah, that was a great opening, Mark. I don't know if I can add more to that. This is the film. Well, first of all, I just want to thank Dr. Kisha Khan Perry, and also Dr. Tasmin Siddiqui, and also Kurt Orderson great to be on the panel. And as a disclaimer, Tasmin Siddiqui and Kisha Kamperi and I are part of the African Walnut Project Collective. So it's a family affair. But I was also a geographer. I did geography for my studies in university. So this is also touches on several points. But I just wanted to touch on the issue concerning the plight of, I'm glad that, especially when looking at these cities, the great thing is looking at the African cities worldwide. As Africa as a continent actually is the most urbanized, is becoming the most urbanized area in the world. The rate of urbanization has been increasing, not just in recent times, actually, this has been an issue since the 1980s, but it's great that we are looking at this issue in the African world context, and particularly looking at it in the, looking at settler societies. When you're looking at South Africa, Brazil, United States, uniquely settler societies, which is a very interesting concept. And also these are port cities that we're looking at. So the issue of migration of in various forms. There's the migration of the colonizer, there's the migration of people moving because it's a port city. You have different people coming in. That creates a different dynamics, various dynamics, some accidental, some not accidental dynamics. And of course, a lot of it has been shaped by the colonization process. And I was glad that I was actually going to mention about, especially one thing that was great in the film that you was visible was the resistance movements that have always taken place within settler society. Because even though we're looking at cities, this is actually a microcosm of the society in general, fending off various aspects of colonization. And the great shot, the great segment on the Brazilian group that was occupying the space, where this was empty because all these buildings were there, but they were placed in a sort of Western concept of property, whereas in the African world concept of space, the space doesn't belong to anyone. I mean, the space in the outside, it belongs to society, it belongs to, so if it's not being used, it needs to be used by human beings, and they take over the buildings. I thought that was a great an analysis, also a great illustration. It was not quite as direct, but it was a great illustration of how to use things which are being which should be used by human beings, but are not being used by human beings. And then I think the other great things that you linked in the films was the criminalization in the various parts, in the different parts, and connecting criminalization of people, where they're talking about what's going on in South Africa today, which is still happened under apartheid, they're using the laws, because people always mistake that laws and justice are the same thing. No, the law is a law. Just because it's a law, it's unjust. And apartheid was a law, but it's not justice. And then now people are using those similar laws to evict people under a so-called democratic society. And then in the same concept in the United States, you have it takes the form of the police using people where they're out in the old days, they'll be out in the streets, playing their drums, talking to each other, connecting with the human beings. But now there are ordinances, so-called new laws, where you cannot be a certain, and this also reminds me of what happened in DC a couple of years ago, where they were trying to shut down the music that was being played around the Howard University from it's a telephone sales store, which is on the corner of 7th and Georgia Avenue. And when you walk by there, they're usually playing go-go music, which is the traditional music of DC, which is very much an African music. And because of the space now becoming gentrified, people are saying it's too loud, and they were trying to shut that music down. And there was a massive movement to make sure that that space stays as it used to be. And of course, if you go there now, they're still playing the go-go music because people demonstrated, because people saw it as an affront to their being, to their well-being. It was not just, it was not about it was more than just the music. It was who they are as a human being. And you're now dehumanizing that space because you said there's no, you can't have this loud music. But I thought it was, the way you did the movie was such a great way of connecting all these dots and really talking, even though you didn't call it a critique of settler colonization. I think it was very much a critique of settler colonization in general as well. And it would be interesting to hear what your analysis, what you're thinking of saying, but that's what I had thought. And also, and some of the other things that came out to me as people were speaking in the film, at the beginning, one of the brothers was saying, the system is not broken, it's designed to work that way. And that's what it is. And I think that's what we have to start thinking, because people are always saying, oh, the system is broken. No, it's not broken. It's actually designed that way. And there's an interesting article which came out of Al Jazeera a couple of years ago. It's called Failed Decolonization of South African Cities Fuels Violence by Nyanjala Nyabola. And where she talks about how during the apartheid system, there was this move to make the central business district the centerpiece of the society. And then as soon as things were starting to change, of course, money started going out of the central business district. And then you've had and now you had empty spaces, and then they took out all the financing and people started moving out, just like exactly what happened in the United States during desegregation as well. And then it's interesting what happens later, because what happens is like what happens here, where you have landlords not allowing, not repairing their houses for a long time to make people leave the place, and then to have no services. And then you have people moving in, taking over again, who hike up the price. So it's very interesting what will happen in South Africa.
Muiza, your mic is muted.
Oh, sorry. Yes, I just saw that. Was I muted all this time? No. Okay. And so it'll be interesting to see what happens in South Africa if the same development happens, where you have people coming in, speculators taking over the central business district and pushing people out again from the central business district as happened under apartheid, which seems to occur all the time. And as we saw in the film in Cape Town, it seems like it's happening again and again. And I don't know what the situation within the Johannesburg context, because that was when you looked at some of the xenophobia violence, it was taking place within the central business district, which is how people going to use that, the incidents that occurred, the xenophobia, they're going to use that as an excuse to push people out and then come back in and hike up the price, as they've done in other countries, in other places, in other cities, whether it's Washington, D.C., whether it's LA, whether it's New York, or in Harlem and others. So those are just my quick observations. And I think we can have a further discussion.
Thank you so much, Muiza. Kurt, I know you're sitting back listening. We really want to hear from you. We want to think about with you, also, what were some of those material and immaterial influences in your work? Where do you see the trajectory of your work moving to after these incredible films?
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Siddiqui and Kisha. It's good to be on a panel with you. And my brother, Muiza, yeah, it's a great honor. Thank you so much for having my work showcased as part of your seminar. And thank you for all the viewers and students, academics who are in the room. Yeah, I mean, when I was thinking about Not in My Neighborhood and I guess the methodology and the pedagogy around the idea of how to create a kind of a tricontinental story that speaks directly to transnational solidarity. How do we think about shared colonial histories, shared lived experiences against kind of neo-colonial policies and ideas that continually subjugates Black and Indigenous people around the world. And for me, I think, if I think about the trajectory of my personal filmography, and I mean, I definitely think about the idea of film specifically as a methodology for social change, but also as an activist tool, right? So I made this film as a part of the tradition and in the history of kind of anti-colonial community-based ideas around resistance, grassroots modes of resistance. So I would like to think about my work in the context to that wave of solidarity, global solidarity. And also I think, obviously a lot of our work and when we articulate and deal with these, excavating this archival material, it comes from a personal space, and Not In My Neighbourhood specifically is a very personal film. To me, my father grew up in Woodstock, where the parts of where the film in Cape Town is set in. And so his nostalgic memory of that space and their family being forcefully evicted because of the apartheid laws of the Group Areas Act, which is mentioned in the film. And both my mom and dad, their families were both victims of this Group Areas Act, and they were pushed to the periphery, known as the Cape Flats, which is a strip of townships. And so this film was really highly inspired by my father's nostalgic memories of when he goes back to a place like Woodstock specifically. But also as I started thinking about my work in the global context and traveling around the world and working in various spaces, I started seeing these markers, right, of colonialism, right, spatial violence, architectural apartheid, and so for me it was really about this kind of global solidarity, and also how do we think about anti-capitalist ways of thinking and remaking notions of resistance, because I think that the way capitalism is structured and the way it's functioned and set up as to basically make people feel docile to a system that they're dependent on, right? And so all these ideas and modes of concepts is really what I was thinking about when, or my hypothesis while I was crafting this story. I think to speak directly to also this idea of the Black Atlantic, and how I think about solidarity. For me, when I think about Cape Town or South Africa, I mean, South Africa was a Dutch and British colonial project, right? And the same story is, we can apply that to, the story of New York, for example. It was also a Dutch colony. And obviously then the Portuguese connecting to South Africa and Brazil, right? So you see how the colonial architecture of colonialism has connected these cities, right? And these countries. So for me, it was really about just excavating the archives and bringing these memories and people's memories to the fore, and to allow people to tell their own story. And it was also, I think, the idea in terms of as a visual pedagogy or anthology of personal stories was also, how do I allow these individuals and these people to virtually connect with each other, right? And to build with each other and to share ways of rethinking the idea of emancipation, and thinking about restorative justice as well, right? So for me, really, this film, and when I think about the legacy of colonialism, spatial apartheid, and gentrification, there's a clear trajectory, right, of the legacy of spatial planning. And so for me, really what's key to hone in when I think about, I mean, the film is really just one element, right, to think about global solidarity. I think my idea was, make this film and let's start kind of, articulating the work when we think about emancipation, right? So anyway, that's just some of the thoughts I was thinking about regarding your question, specifically about personal stories and my connectivity to the material.
Thank you so much. I mean, the film is so rich. There's so many horizons and possibilities. And I would say that in Africana film and in documentary film and the films that you're creating, and I was thinking a lot about, as I was just trying to frame our conversation, I was thinking about some questions that Arthur Jaffa poses for his work, and thinking about two particular questions that I thought was so resonant in your work. One was, how do you bring what he would term a poly eventuality to the film? And how do you bring a kind of, and I think that, and we've sort of talked about these contours, but how do you bring a kind of attentiveness and acute awareness to the things happening in relation to space and temporality as well? Because as we're watching, I mean, this is a story that can be told all over the African world, all over the world, right? And it's building upon these very specific historical logics of dehumanization, really, of what it means to be human, that is underwritten by Western modernity in our modern world. So I'll let you ask that. And again, for folks that are involved in the conversation, please feel free to ask questions in the chat, raise your hand. We would love to really engage with everyone here.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and Arthur Jaffa, obviously one of my heroes as a visual, not just as a cinematographer, but just as someone who contribute to this great legacy of the Black aesthetic, in popular culture. And I think, coming back to my personal story, I grew up in a settler colony, right? And Cape Town specifically is the epitome of the settler colony, right? I mean, it's one of the most unequal cities in the world, right? In terms of its unemployment rates, in terms of service delivery, kind of racialized apartheid, all of that, right? And just how, post-apartheid South Africa, or I can't even call it really post-apartheid South Africa, because it's still, people are still caught up, in the yoke of colonialism, right? And I think, reflecting on what manifested in 2015 with the student uprisings at the University of Cape Town, with Rhodes Must Fall, and this global movement around decolonization. I mean, colonial iconography is basically, what bombarded my childhood, right? You had these statues of all these, like, supposed, leaders of the settler colony, and were sent to South Africa to modernize and to Europeanize the country of South Africa, but also the rest of the continent, right? And so that was basically what bombarded my childhood, thinking about when traveling as a kid from the periphery, the Cape Flats, my township, to the inner city. It's a 30-minute drive, and to get there, and it's coming back to Kisha's point around, when we think about gentrification, we can't think of in isolation outside of the idea of how, how segregated cities are developed and built, and when people are pushed, who's pushed to the periphery, and how do people have to access, to enter the spaces for economic mobility, etc. And Cape Town specifically, I mean, the geography of that space is exactly that. And I think about the cartography of settler colonialism. And so having this lived experience of, being bombarded by this colonial architecture, it's really what shaped my politics and my visual aesthetic. When I think about myself also as a, I would like to think myself as an activist, and my contribution to global solidarity and liberation. And so, I mean, there's certain perpetual forms of neo-capitalist and colonial policies that really interest my work as well. And in this context, it's, for example, when I think about the directory, coming back to the idea of what brought this film to life, I made, and this film came out of a 5-minute visual art piece, right? It was was part of this collective exhibition. It was part of Cape Town. It was this 5-minute film, right? And it was really a kind of visual anthology as an observational piece on one of the main streets in Cape Town, right? So I was trying to observe this road and the changes over a course of like 6 months, right, or a year, whatever. And then from this 5-minute piece, it kind of developed into, you know, a 32-minute piece, and it became a 45-minute work in progress. And then basically just organically, the story started shaping as I started moving around different spaces and learning about the complexity around gentrification and finding new languages, because before gentrification became kind of part of pop culture, you know, in South Africa, we spoke about spatial apartheid, right? And so when I think about these ideas and these like legacies of people being subjugated and kept out of spaces for economic mobility, and I also think about, like, for example, the history of plantocracy, for example, in whether it's in South Africa or in the Caribbean, etc. There's a clear, you know, correlation that one can draw to all these systemic forms of violence, right? Historically speaking, from plantation, and this is also speaking to South Africa, Cape Town. You know, Cape Town is one of the biggest exporters of wine, right? And 80% of the GDP of the Western Cape, which Cape Town is part of, relies on this wine, the export of wine. But very little is always mentioned about labor exploitation, for example, on these plantations, because it really is literally plantations. People live in appalling situations, lack of clean water, sanitation. But these are farm workers who are, you know, harvesting the grapes, right? That's going to be exported. It's going to be bottled and exported to America, UK, Britain, I mean, Germany, etc. And so, while thinking about Not in My Neighborhood, I was thinking about these legacies of oppression. And so, for me, really, coming back to this question around, I mean, also the fundamental question also is around the nation state as well, right? Kind of who belongs and whose narrative and story belongs in the archives, right? And also who's allowed to tell that story as well, right? So for me, it's like the idea around decolonizing the gaze, right? So, you know, and here I'm obviously referencing the history of ethnographic and anthropological cinema as part of the broader colonial project, right? Of how we were depicted as savages on the African continent and in the Americas and wherever Black people were situated. And this includes obviously the subjugation and the colonial violence of indigenous people. We are on the settler colony as well, right? You know, I happen to find myself here in Baltimore, you know, and I recently learned that, you know, the Lenape people are the indigenous people. So, you know, also paying homage to that, to the history of the Lenape people. And so, coming back to, I mean, just thinking about this idea of citizenship and the nation state and this context of, I mean, there's also a deeper question around class politics as well, right? You know, what's the positionality of the middle class, for example, when we're thinking about gentrification, for example, right? When you look at kind of how these urban policies are designed, it is the middle class that becomes a vanguard, right? For the petty bourgeoisie, you know, capitalist class. And that basically just pushes the working class out of, you know, the inner cities, and they have to kind of find their way, you know, wherever they are evicted to. You know, there was like, you know, just making, I mean, we've shot this film over a time of 4 years, right? So you can just imagine like the material that we sat with, I mean, sitting with like, I don't know, like 8 terabytes of material and then having to decide, you know, what goes into the film, right? It's a very violent process, actually. We think about, you know, which also like, I think there's also a question around when I think about positionality as a filmmaker, also as a man as well, right? Like, you know, whose story is important, right? And whose story should be part of this narrative arc that you're telling. But at the same time, I think it's also about, it's beyond the the kind of finished product. It's also about archiving as well, right? Archiving memory, archiving history, archiving my story as well, my personal story, the story of my people. And this is also for me what's powerful about, I think, to one level of like cinema. And then there's also a contradiction around image capitalism as well, right? And we see it, through this kind of like Hollywood, idea of like success and what's a good film, and but there's also a massive pushback as well, right? Like around why is Hollywood still white, and and allowing more people of color to tell their own stories. Going back to just the idea around the importance of archiving and weaving that into other narratives, right? This is not the end product. This Not In My Neighbourhood is not the end product. There's other narrative that also should be crafted. And that goes beyond my body of work as well, right? It's also a kind of reach out to inspire other people to also tell their own story, right? So that, anyways, I'll stop there for now. Thank you.
No, we love it. We love to see it too, because I mean, you're talking about archives, and so I have students on the call as well too. It's because we're using a Black geographies framework in order for us to be able to read these archives, right? Because the archives occupy this space, this duality of, on the one hand, it can be potentially this radical space of possibility. On the other hand, it is the house of the superior magistrate, and I'm thinking about Jacques Derrida's Archive Fever, and the ways in which Black historians and intellectuals have really challenged, Sadia Hartman, Jennifer Morgan, have challenged the ways in which, or troubled the ways in which we think about the archive, particularly in this context of racial capitalism and colonialism. How do we tell our stories, and how do we, it's not even just the ways in which we tell our stories, but when we're thinking about mining through these archives that really work in a lot of ways as a mortuary, that work in a way where, you can go through hundreds of pages that can be mind-numbing. You can kind of be in this stupor when you're trying to find some more texture about the lives and the communities, about ourselves as well too. And then these are not necessarily the spaces in which we do that. So what are the ways in which, or what are the methodologies, what are the theories that we use to illustrate our stories and use the archival work in a way that is really kind of even against what the archive itself represents and stands for. I did want to let Kisha Khan to jump in as well too, because you had also mentioned this role of gender, and her work is so important when we think about the ways in which, especially when we're looking at Brazil and the MTST and the MST and the leadership of Africana women, poor Africana women that have mobilized and organized thousands of people around housing, around police violence, around inequality, around land rights, around water. So Kisha Khan, I would love you to kind of come into this conversation. And when we're thinking about the role of knowledge and knowledge production, and we're thinking about really the collective and communal ethos that really kind of runs through these organizations, and it's spearheaded by women.
Thank you so much for that question, or the nudge, to say the least. I keep muting myself because I'm afraid of what noise from a video game may pop up in the background. My son would like to thank all of you for the extended event tonight, so he can play all hours of video games. So there's that. So there are so many things that I want to celebrate about this film. One is, I think I see it almost as an ethnographic project, as well, an archival and ethnographic project. And I think oftentimes nowadays, a lot of these ideas kind of stay in the realm of the abstract. A lot of people don't, we don't want to do that hard. We can imagine what inequality looks like, but the reality situation is that we're living around it all the time, right? Our cities are divided by highways. We know which side of the city, for example, we live in, that are being, what side is being devastated by the coronavirus. We know which housing, who is having their housing demolished. We know where the heavy policing is taking place. We know which city blocks and which neighborhoods are exporting the most amount of people to this massive military and prison industrial complex. We know where the vast amount of money is being invested in policing. We know how much money is being invested in particular areas to police transportation, such as people jumping the turnstile. And we know then, in contrast, where there's a divestment in public education, there's a divestment in public health, et cetera. So I think what is wonderful about these kinds of films is that it really brings to light the material investment in white supremacy, how much money. And I think when I emphasize the Cost of War Project, when I talk about the dollar value, the actual amount of money it takes to maintain white supremacy, right? And I think what people don't understand is that this is all interconnected part of the project. It is expensive to maintain white supremacy. It is expensive to clothe a militarized police officer, campus police officers. The same amount of money that they then say is unavailable to cancel student debt, is unavailable to invest in more vaccines, and is unavailable for other social, for free housing and social housing, not just for working people, but the so-called middle class that's spending 60% of their salaries on housing each month, right? So I think that's something, I think what I love about this film is how real it is. And oftentimes, a lot of the population in these cities are living in a constant state of precarity, where they are 1 month, a few days, a legal case away from being displaced and separated from their families, from their neighbors, from their kin, in many ways, right? I also think it's fascinating. Another key part of I think you mentioned, is that another key part of the film is how much these cities depend on a discourse of diversity, of cultural plurality, etc. But the first time the Latino owner of the ice cream truck puts on his music too loud, or in the case that Muiza said, that when the actual people of DC that produce the vibrant DC as we know it actually start being themselves, the police is called, they're a nuisance. The ice cream truck is too loud. The bodega attendant is not doing, it doesn't have, the right, what they're supposed to have. And so you see how the people who actually produce the spaces are, in essence, end up being pushed out, right? Or they take over neighborhood schools, and local children can't enjoy those resources. So I think it's really important. It's a very complex understanding of so the very cities who produce these global cities, the language, the food, all of these things that make these cities dynamic and wonderful and beautiful are being displaced, and they want to push people further and further away from the places of work, the restaurants, et cetera, where they're producing culture. They want to push them further and further away. And a lot of architects, urban engineers, civil engineers that are participating in reproducing these cities of these unequal cities. So I think that's really important. There was another point that came up that I want to emphasize, is the kinds of ideas that come out of social movements. I think women, specifically poor women, underemployed women, are not seen as thinkers, political producers of political knowledge. Cities are seen as politically bankrupt. Black women are seen as ignorant, lacking any sort of good critique of capitalism, critiques of urban development. They're not seen as being able to produce an alternative. So I think that's what the film highlights, that there are people who are thinking together, thinking out loud, strategizing, collaborating with lawyers, et cetera, to canvassing door to door with their children. I think it's really important to see how grassroots politics takes place, but the ideas that come out. I mean, police abolition, all of those ideas come out of social movements, even, and not just in the abstract sense, it's from doing the work, right? People experiencing the loss of housing, being incarcerated and then coming back to housing that they've lost. Those are where these ideas such as police abolition and end to mass incarceration comes from. As the activist said, it's having been incarcerated that led him to participate in a movement against incarceration. So I think there's so much more that I could emphasize. And of course, again, the ethnography itself producing a new set of archives and I think the raw footage, I'm sure, there's so much more that future researchers, scholars, filmmakers will end up drawing from, just as you drew from old films of oppressive institutions and the maps and how, so hopefully your own film will become kind of a rich archive for future scholars and filmmakers down the line. So again, I want to congratulate you. And of course, I'd love to hear what the audience have to say as well.
I just wanted to interject, piggybacking on what Kisha said about the archives. I think the great thing about the film is that sometimes archives are relegated into a building still for academics just to look at, but I think the film makes it like archive is a moving and breathing thing, a human thing that is, as you're talking about, because it touched me when Kurt, you're talking about this film is about the memory, your family's memory as well, and that's very much touched in the film about this moving. You're not just moving. You're not just moving buildings or just physical human beings. You're moving the culture. You're moving the stories. You're moving. The people are being forced out of there. It's not just a space of just a physical space. It's a living, breathing space of human that has stories. It makes us human. And I think that's what. So I think what the film does well is show that archiving is not just this static thing that for academics in a building studying, but it's part of our daily life experience. And I think that's very critical in what the film has done, piggybacking what Kisha said. But I think also the other thing about the expensiveness of keeping up with white supremacy. In the apartheid system, there were like 4 departments where you had 4 departments for everything. You had to have a white department, you had to have an Indian department, Asian, and the so-called African Blacks department, and so-called mixed race department. That takes a lot of money. So during apartheid, and it's absorbed a lot of money, and it's very expensive dealing with that as well. So I think that's one thing that should be emphasized as well, because there's always this thing about when, especially in the South African case, when yes, there have been mistakes made by the government that took over, but it had to actually bring in all the ill management of the government by the apartheid government. It was actually, most people don't, it actually had to restructure the whole government structure, which was not how you manage a society, because everything was spilt. You had to bring them all as one from that system. Of course, they have a long way to go to doing that. It's still a long way to go because of business interests. And again, it comes back to this issue of businesses, which was also raised in the film. When especially the 2 sisters in Brooklyn who were being evicted. As soon as the people had their way, they decided, okay, we can throw you out in 30 days, because big business is the heart of the matter. And just like in South Africa, one reason why apartheid started changing was because business started seeing it as uneconomical. Not because of morality. They saw it as uneconomical. They couldn't get enough workers to get on, educated workers in the white population. They had to start getting Black workers now in certain aspects of their companies, and it was uneconomical for them. So it's very interesting, that dynamic as well, hashing it out as well.
So we have 2 questions in the chat for Kurt, and I'll read, if it might be a little bit easier for you, I'll read both of them. And if you need me to remind you of the second one, I'm happy to do that. The first one is, they commented it was a really fascinating documentary and discussion. And they wanted to know from Kurt, colonial iconography is sort of changing, renaming of streets, airports, cities, as recent as like the past week. What do you make of the idea of a hijacked decolonial project that is decolonial practices spearheaded by the same government that is evicting Black folks from their homes? The second question is, and it's also one of our students, our former students, Maya Garrison. I'm currently struggling with this idea of practice of disrupting the archive and trying to balance between telling a story of the Black imagination and not just trauma, although they are so intertwined with each other. So any comments or questions that you, or responses that you have to that?
Hey, y'all.
Oh, Kurt, I think you are muted.
Oh, my bad. So, yeah, thank you for the question. It's really a pertinent and fascinating time in South Africa right now, because there's a whole supposed decolonial, decolonization process undergoing with the renaming of street names, airports, etc. And I mean, there's a clear correlation between, the student uprising that took place during 2015, Roads Must Fall. And it's true, it's hijacking that political discourse, right? That social grassroots movement to now speak about this idea around, kind of quasi supposed rainbowness projects, right? To kind of speak directly to, how do we think about South Africa, the new South Africa, the South Africa that has arrived, the kind of South Africa's modernity to global capitalism, all of that, right? So I think, on one degree, so my answer is twofold here. So, we've been fighting and having loudspeakers in front of Parliament for many, many years, protests, etc. that I was part of personally, that I documented and were part of kind of organizing. And so we've been talking about, the removal of statues, for example, in and around South Africa. And my lived experience in South Africa is kind of set between Cape Town and Johannesburg. So I lived in Johannesburg for 8 years. And, when you think about the East, where the capital of South Africa is in the place called what's formerly known as Pretoria, now known as Tshwane, which is also kind of part of the renaming. And there's been this long legacy of post-1994 kind of reshaping and renaming and kind of getting rid of the yoke of apartheid, colonialism, and kind of grappling with this idea of neocolonialism in a new South Africa, right? And so I remember, I think it was in KZN, in KwaZulu-Natal, the King Zwelithini, who started renaming the whole of KZN, especially the kind of capital, Durban, right? eThekwini. It's also have been renamed. So there's been this long trajectory of renaming since post 1994. But there's also the argument from civil society around so how much money is this costing, right? To rename these airports and because we're talking about infrastructure, right? And so we're also then talking about a term that's coined in South Africa called tender entrepreneurship, right? So these kind of local municipality, city council, etc., who now are campaigning for tenders. So everyone was saying so this last week there's the Eastern Cape, for example, which is famous. I mean, the person who kind of came out of Eastern Cape was Nelson Mandela, right? And so there's a whole renaming of all the metropolitan cities. And so the question is about also so who's the complexity around memory and who gets remembered, right? Who's I guess history is more important. And this idea is there's also the complexity around kind of First Nationness in South Africa. So who was the first nation? Who's the biggest tribe? And that's very dangerous identity politics, right? And we saw how the apartheid system played with that, right? And here I'm referencing the 1990s wars between Inkatha Freedom Party and ANC, which was tribal wars, right? And you had this long history of what's known as so-called Bantustans, right? And so where the apartheid system had, created these leaders, right, of homeland states, right? And these homelands became vanguards for this kind of capitalist apartheid state, right? To exist and to function, you know, and have modes and systems in place, right? And so when I bring reference to that history, right, and to the now contemporary South Africa and around this discourse around renaming and decolonization, I think the question still, what's critical here is the question around, can we maybe first focus on the basic needs around food, clothing, and shelter, right? And housing, right? There's a big issue of backlog around housing in South Africa. There's a major crisis around service delivery, electricity. South Africa's, like, you know, as a so-called welfare state, it has been grappled and been dealing with issues around decolonization and this mass kind of, you know, mechanism and machinery around how these multinational corporations has hijacked the growth of South Africa, right? In terms of its GDP and the potential of South Africa. And so you have these statesmen, mostly men, who end up, you know, being the supposed black partner, right? And then basically, you know, screwing their own people, right? In this case, so you have stories of, you know, this famous family called the Guptas, right? Who arrived in South Africa in the 90s, right? And so they hijacked the economy of South Africa under Jacob Zuma, right? And so now all these cases are coming up. So right now we have what's known as the Sunder Commission, like a form of like TRC, right? Around corruption, kind of getting rid of the yoke of corruption and like basically calling out individuals who've been perpetrators, right? And so, I mean, I'll end off with one case study of in the Free State, right? And there was a part of a transformative project around what's known as the RDP, which was Nelson Mandela's project around reconstruction development project, right? As was to get rid of like asbestos rooftops on people's roofs, right? And asbestos, I mean, obviously we know the history of asbestos and lead poisoning, all of that. And so there was this big tender, right? Millions and millions were poured into the Free State to basically, you know, remove the asbestos and build like sustainable roofs, whatever, you know, and infrastructure. And these cronies, these ward councillors, you know, provincial leaders basically stole millions and millions, right? And so here the question is around, you know, what is the moral compass, right? How do we basically forget about the fight for independence and fight for liberation and for economic freedom when we ourselves are oppressing our own people, right? So this is, I mean, this direct correlation, I think, with this idea around, you know, how do we, you know, who hijacks the decolonial project, right? That was started, you know, under the building blocks of grassroots movements, student movements, etc. And so, yeah, I mean, I mean, I think for me, what's fundamental right now is to, you know, take care. Let's start with like kind of the foundations, right? Because South Africa is, it's a reconstruction. It's under reconstruction, and so for me, we need to maybe first start with like what is maybe more immediate and pertinent right now for the masses, which is housing, which is food, clothing, and shelter, employment, etc.
I just want to follow up to that really important point, and just to echo is that if we don't begin to see housing justice and the socialization of housing as one of the most basic kind of human rights, I think I don't know where else we're gonna. I mean, it's, you know, I think it's all tied to the struggle over healthcare for all. I mean, all of these things. I mean, it's tied to, as Kurt mentioned, basic infrastructure in terms of water. We see, you know, some of the other kind of public goods like electricity, or even just power in general. So I think, but the basic when we think about just in terms of the basic right to shelter and why it's still not foregrounded on the state's agenda, I think it's really important to think about, right? What would it look like if that $6.4 trillion had been spent on good quality housing in the since post 9/11, right? And I want to emphasize that it's not just about people, for example, who need 100% their houses subsidized, but also what happens to people, like I said before, who are spending 60-70% of their income on housing in this country. So there, and I think there's a lot of scholars who talk about that the social housing project is not just about housing for the poor. It's about the fact that even people who are earning a decent income are not living on the edge because they're spending much of their family income every month on housing, right? I think we've normalized that in the same way we've normalized the cost of education in this country. I think we really need to rethink what it means to have dignified housing and good education for free or much more accessible. So I think we really need to think about how those are connected. Yes, and yes, Professor Pope, and we think about the trillions it just cost to bomb Syria, right? So I think the cost, I encourage some of you to look at the Cost of War project that is available on the Watson Institute website at Brown University. I think it was Terry Khan on the chat that made a comment about some of the connections across the diaspora and asking for some contextualization. I won't answer that question for Kurt, but I would say that this documentary could have been about anywhere in the world, right? And I think partly what I've done in my own work is to see those connections. And I think that is the beautiful part about this project, is that oftentimes we think that Brazil is exceptional. We think that the US Black movements are exceptional. We think that South Africa is exceptional. But what happens when we start to think about, one, colonialist ideas and colonialist logics as always circulating, that the oppressors and colonialists were talking to each other, strategizing with each other, and you see the legacy of those knowledges today, and those ideas still continue to circulate in the same way that the US exports arms, or China exports arms, or Israel export arms, or whoever, that these ideas of how to militarize, of how to wage war, these military states, militarized states are in conversation. They trade goods, tools, military weapons, strategies. They train each other's soldiers, police forces. They exchange ideas about how to build the best prisons, et cetera. So I think they exchange strategies on how to stop immigrants at borders so that they don't even get to the Mexican border. They're stopped in Panama, Costa Rica, Belize, et cetera, right? So I think we have to think about, what does it mean when we start to think about that these colonialist logics are interconnected and people are in conversation with, in the same way that engineers are trained at the University of Chicago, then exchange knowledges with engineers at University of Cape Town, architects, urban architects, et cetera, are also in conversation with each other about how to build the best cities, how to have benches that have spikes on them so no one can sit in Lebanon, in Beirut, the same way that they're also built in places like São Paulo so that the homeless can't sit and sleep at night, the same way that we have no benches the benches are being taken out of New York City subways, right? So these are ideas and practices and tools of urban planning, of urban exclusion that are circulated. So you see the parallels. And this also means that in the most abstract sense, ideas around citizenship, who can belong and who does not belong in nation states are also, you see who are being pushed further and further away, either not allowed to enter the country, or further and further away from the most economically profitable parts of the city, or even access to the most basic resources like public health care, good housing, et cetera. So, or even just to be able to participate in the public sphere, or just access basic public spaces of leisure, such as the parks, right? That you can't even have a kid walk into the store with a bag of Skittles. He can't play in the playground across the street without the risk of being killed, right? And when you occupy those spaces and you're out of place, and you're moving in those spaces at the risk of losing your life, right? So I think those are the kinds of things that we can see across the parallels across the diaspora. And I think I'll just end there. I think there was another question that comment Tarakan had about why the focus on the displacement in New York. And again, Kurt can answer that question himself, but I would say that I would see the struggle over economic independence as also being tied to the struggle for housing. So I don't see the displacement of Black-owned businesses, and Black-owned businesses, not just in terms of for profit, et cetera, in terms of a capitalist logic, but what it means, and Du Bois talked about this in terms of land and acquisition of land, not just for capitalist reasons, but what it meant in terms of as a missed opportunity oftentimes with the preservation of Black businesses, Black institutions, as an opportunity for economic independence, right? For collective independence. These organizations and businesses that are, important in communities in terms of for circulating information, education, barbershops, et cetera, that are important spaces of education, doing political work, mutual aid, and even just informal things like babysitting. I mean, how many times you've gone to a barbershop and there was somebody's kid waiting for their parent to come. So I think that these are much more complicated ways of thinking about the struggle over space that the businesses, the small businesses, as well as the housing complex, as well as the vendor who may or may not be legalized, occupying sidewalks that are also now being pushed off for more perfect European-built magazine stands and the informal kind of vendors that have traditionally occupied these spaces. So it's not to be, those small shops are not to be separated in how we understand the displacement taking place from the housing, that the Starbucks are now cleaning off sidewalks, and public housing being demolished. And we can see that in cities like Newark, New Jersey, where I finished high school, New York. I mean, they're all over the place. I think that the question is valid, but I would also not see them as completely separate. That when you have to travel further and further away from where you live, or you can't afford to really even pursue a small business in a place that you are marginally living, I think it's something worth thinking about. I'm sorry for that long comment. That's what happens when you spend too much time by yourself at home.
No, excellent. I'm just going to piggyback on what you said about these people speaking together. I think because we forget this is a system, the colonial system, which was, especially when you talk about South Africa, when we mentioned the Bantustans right now, people forget that it was the study here. They looked at the reservation system here, and then they instituted the Bantustan system in South Africa. And of course, people like, of course, Hitler also focused on the study of the United States, so how they subjugated African people here to mount his experiment in Germany. So that we forget there's always a system within the ruling class that's always evolving and always interacting with each other. And it's a global system. It's not just stuck in South Africa. It's multifaceted. So and that's all I wanted to add on that aspect.
I also wanted to just point to a comment from Dr. Pope, who also want to give a shout out. So most of our Africa World Now Project Media Collective is here in the room, and he's the silent hand that brings us together. So we're so thankful for all of his work and his intellectual and spiritual and creative labor. But he made this really important comment as Dr. Kisha Conperry was talking: gentrification equals precision colonialism. And that's what we're seeing. We're seeing the modalities of colonialism becoming more quote, and I hate to use this terminology, but more efficient and more precise. So we're at 8:56, and I would love to keep going. And I'm so thankful and grateful and happy that people decided to spend their Friday night with us and stayed on for this incredible conversation to view this incredible film. I'm going to let our panelists offer some closing comments. And if there are any last questions that folks have that they want to ask, please feel free to do so. I'm monitoring the chat too, so I'm getting a lot of direct messages that are just talking about how incredible this conversation is, how amazing it is. And I am getting some questions just about the recording of the conversation, and this will be published on our media platform, Africa World Now Project. So you can find us on all social media, on all social media handles, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, as well. And the archive shows are on Spotify, iTunes, SoundCloud. And I think, am I missing any other one? No. Okay, great. So please look forward to that. Yes, we're everywhere. We're intergalactic. Any closing comments that Muiza, Kisha Khan, or Kurt would like to offer, or any questions? I hate to cut off the conversation, but I do want to, let people get on with whatever they need to do tonight.
Just thanks to James Pope as well, Dr. James Pope. And also I wanted to mention the movement that he actually made sure I remind folks, it was that Don't Mute DC, the movement that was in DC that rose up. But I also want to thank Kurt for the film, and Dr. Tasmin Sadiq for putting together, and Kisha Camperi as well for your wonderful expertise. And I'm looking forward to part 2 of the film, because it'll be interesting to see, especially in light of the fact that this was taken right before the Trump administration. And I was lurking in the background, and it was very prophetic. One of the people in the film said, "No, this is a done deal. Who's going to win the election?" Actually, that's something that we've because they saw the writing on the wall. I think sometimes we in this field are always blinded by listening to talking heads or so, but not looking at exactly what's happening on the ground. But I think they were more astute to what's happening in the United States. And I think that's one great thing of the film, that it really gave you the pulse of what was going on in each of these areas, whether it's the USA or South Africa or Brazil. Because of course, Brazil, as we know, a similar situation happened where Bolsonaro has taken over Trump too. So, and one of the great things of this film, I think it really sheds light on the realities of what's taking place within not just the urban areas that we're dealing with, but beyond the urban areas. And because the film was looking at microcosm of a specific urban environment, but it's really a critique on the general society, because even though we're talking about Sao Paulo or New York or Cape Town, but you could be really talking about the whole countries of these countries and worldwide, of the plight as we're talking about housing, the need for housing, the scarcity of water. Even though in the South African Constitution, I believe housing is supposed to be a human right in the South African Constitution, but we still have yet to be achieving that goal. It doesn't seem to be part of the urgent matter of the current administration. And of course, in the United States, housing is not supposed to be, is being framed as not a human right. And hence you have to pay your mortgage at an exorbitant price, and you have to, and you can't find good housing rent for other people as well who just want to rent. But and also as we talk about healthcare, so it really makes us think of what should be, not what is. I'll leave it at that.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to let Kurt have the last word. I want to say, one, congratulations again on this film. I love this film, primarily because I just think that it really exemplifies why we always have to think globally and how our struggles are interconnected. I mean, I think that's really, really important. So I'll continue to teach this film. All students are always impressed, not just by the technical beauty of the film, but also just how thoughtful you were in terms of putting these stories together. So thank you so much for that. And then also, again, I'll just keep repeating, that's my platform for the rest of my life, is we should not be mortgaged to death. Housing should be for all. And we should, as Muiza said, in terms of thinking, we should thinking about what it means to give the land back, including in global cities. So thank you so much, Kurt. Wonderful, wonderful film. Congratulations. And I look forward to watching the other film as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for your kind words. it's a humbling experience to be in the room with amazing folks who are doing amazing work, in their corners, in their individual spaces, etc. I mean, in terms of closing comments, I would just like to reiterate this idea of, when we think about these issues, we have to think about within the context of intersectionality as well, right? And that these issues are not in isolation. And global capitalism, right, is the driving force. So what's the response from the working class is that we also have to mobilize, right? As global capitalism is mobilizing, we also have to mobilize. And for me, this film is my contribution to that conversation, right? As one is that it creates a body of work which becomes part of a broader archive outside of the making of this film, but also as an educational tool, as an activist tool, right? That people can use as a form of pedagogy, as a methodology, because really this, we in a kind of zeitgeist moment, a new dispensation where we're becoming the orators and the griots of our own stories, right? And so for me, it's like, how do we think about cutting through the gaze, the colonial gaze, right? And remembering and retelling our own personal narratives. And I also just want to reiterate that, when I thought about this idea of spatial violence, I was thinking a lot about Palestine, for example, right? And, I just want to, pay homage and in solidarity, to that ongoing struggle. It's a struggle of the Western Sahara as well. And many other occupied colonial nations and nation states. And so I think also just, to reiterate that I was mentioning about this, the archive portal. So we created an actual project that kind of came out of Not In My Neighbourhood. It's called, it's titled Chronicles of Spatial Violence. And it's a methodology, I guess you could call it, where we created a 20-part series of like short videos. And basically these are like, I would say, B-roll and interviews that didn't end up in the film, in the 86-minute feature-length documentary, but it's individuals that you'll also meet who were part of the filmmaking process, right? Because when I was thinking about making this film, I was also thinking about this paying homage to the tradition of third cinema as well, right? It kind of came out of Latin America and Brazil specifically, creating cinema outside of the boundaries of kind of capitalistic ideas of modes of making artistic work, right? And so pay homage to that movement. We created, this teaching tool that we use these vignettes, montages as a 20-part series that's available on YouTube. I can forward the link. And also creating a space where these, if you can call it visual montages, can be placed in different parts of the world. So kind of the idea is, how has gentrification or spatial violence impacted your family, your community? So then we share this body of work of 20. So it's between each video is about between 2 minutes and 5 minutes. So it's like easy, digestible, And so we've been using that project as well as part of our Not In My Neighbourhood screening tour, as the film been traveling around the world. Obviously now it's virtual, right? And we're also planning an exhibition as well, a kind of moving mobile pop-up cinema exhibition. We plan to actually do a leg of it here in Baltimore, and then and wherever else, wherever. The idea is also opening up the space to whoever feels to want to use the material, wants to contribute to the material of telling their own story about their communities, and kind of packaging it as a broader archival project as well, right? And includes it's inclusive, that allows other people to make films as well, right? Yeah, so again, thank you so much. And yeah, I'm looking forward to building, and breaking bread. Appreciate it. Ashe.
Asheo, thank you so much, Kurt. Thank you, Dr. Kisha Kamperi. Thank you, Muiza, James Pope, and Dr. Pope really reminded us as you were talking about third cinema, we're thinking about the LA Film Rebellion. I'm thinking about people like Holly Garima, Charles Burnett, Julie Dash. So along with that vision, I want to leave with, the struggle continues, and our responsibility is to continue to organize, to study, and to agitate until we're all free. So thank you so much, everyone. Have a good night. We will see you next month, March 23rd. We'll have hopefully, it's a continuation of the conversation that we had tonight with We Rise for Our Land. So thank you so much, Kurt. And you all be safe. Please wear a mask, wash your hands, and be peaceful. We'll see you soon.
Thank you
Peace.
very much.
Appreciate
Thank
it.
you.